I used to think storage auctions were just about finding treasure in other people's junk. You know the drill. Show up early, peek through the rolled-up door for 30 seconds, bid on whatever looks promising, and hope you strike gold. Maybe you'd find some vintage furniture, old electronics, or, if you were really lucky, something valuable enough to flip for a decent profit. It was supposed to be simple. It was supposed to be fun. I'd been doing it for about 6 months when I bought Unit 247. 6 months of moderately successful finds. Nothing spectacular, but enough to justify the hobby and maybe make a few $100s here and there. I had a system down. I knew what to look for, how to spot the difference between actual antiques and worthless replicas, and most importantly, I knew when to walk away. Unit 247 should have been a walk away. Even thinking about it now, everything about that auction felt wrong from the moment I arrived. The storage facility was older than the others I'd visited, tucked away in a part of town that seemed to exist in permanent twilight even at noon. The other bidders were quieter than usual, shuffling around with their hands in their pockets, avoiding eye contact. When the auctioneer rolled up the door to Unit 247, nobody moved forward for the usual closer inspection. But what I saw in that 30-second glimpse looked promising. Furniture covered in white sheets, boxes that appeared to be carefully labeled, and what looked like it might be a vintage desk in the back corner. Standard estate sale overflow, probably from some elderly person who'd passed away and left their family to deal with decades of accumulated possessions. The kind of unit that usually contained exactly what it appeared to contain. Nothing more, nothing less. The bidding started at $50. Nobody raised their hand. 60, 70, still nothing. By the time it reached $80, I was the only one with my hand up, and frankly, I was starting to wonder what everyone else knew that I didn't. The auctioneer called it once, twice, and on the third call, I became the proud owner of Unit 247 for $85. The moment I handed over my money and got the keys, the other bidders started leaving, not just moving on to the next unit, actually leaving the facility entirely. The auctioneer handed me the paperwork with a look I couldn't quite read and reminded me I had 24 hours to clear everything out. I should have asked questions. I should have wondered why a unit full of what appeared to be decent furniture went for less than $100. I should have noticed that the paperwork felt older than it should have, that the key was heavier than the cheap locks they usually used, and that the unit number 247 was painted in a different style than all the others. But I didn't ask questions. I just took the key and started making plans to rent a truck for the next day. That was 4 months ago. I still have the key. I just don't use it anymore. Hey, I'm here with the creepy journal where horror starts like memory and ends like a nightmare you can't wake up from. If you're new here, we explore the kind of stories that make you question what's real and what's just the shadows your mind creates in the dark. Subscribe before the walls start whispering, because trust me, once they start, they don't stop. My interest in storage auctions started innocently enough. I'd been watching those reality shows where people buy abandoned units and find valuable antiques or rare collectibles. And after a particularly boring stretch at my regular job, I decided to try it out. What's the worst that could happen? I'd lose a few $100s and end up with someone else's junk. What's the best that could happen? I'd find something valuable and maybe turn this into a profitable side business. The first few auctions were exactly what I expected. I bought 3 units over the course of 2 months, broke even on 2 of them, and made about $300 profit on the third. Nothing life-changing, but enough to keep me interested. The community of regular bidders was friendly enough, and I was starting to learn the unspoken rules of the game. Then came the auction at Millbrook Storage on a Tuesday in March. I'd never been to this particular facility before, but it was only about 20 minutes from my house, and they were clearing out a significant number of units. The ad in the paper mentioned 15 units going up for auction, which was more than I'd seen at any single event. The facility itself was older than the modern, climate-controlled places I'd grown accustomed to. The buildings were painted institutional green, with roll-up doors that looked like they'd been installed sometime in the 1970s. The office was a small trailer at the front of the property, and the whole place had that slightly run-down feeling of a business that was functional but hadn't seen any updates in decades. I arrived about 30 minutes before the auction started, which gave me time to walk around and get a feel for the property. The units were arranged in long rows, with wide enough aisles for moving trucks but not much else. Most of the buildings had 20 to 30 units each, numbered consecutively. I found Building C, where most of the auctions were taking place, and started looking for the unit numbers listed in the advertisement. That's when I first noticed something odd about Unit 247. It was at the end of Building C, but the numbering didn't make sense. The units on either side were 245 and 249. There was number 246, and 248 was 2 units further down the row. It was like someone had retrofitted an extra unit into a space that wasn't originally designed for it. When the auctioneer started the rounds, I followed the group from unit to unit. The first few were typical storage unit contents: some furniture, boxes of household items, a few pieces of exercise equipment. Nothing spectacular, but nothing suspicious either. The bidding was competitive, but not cutthroat, and I managed to win a unit full of books and vintage kitchenware for $65. But as we got closer to Unit 247, I noticed that the other bidders were becoming quieter. The usual chatter about what they'd spotted in the quick glimpse, the speculation about potential value, the friendly trash talking about who was going to bid against whom, all of it just stopped. By the time we reached Unit 247, the group had thinned out considerably. Several people had simply walked back to their cars and left, even though there were still 3 units left to auction. When the auctioneer unlocked Unit 247 and rolled up the door, I understood why the crowd had grown quiet, but I didn't understand why they'd left. The unit was packed, but it was packed neatly. Sheet-covered furniture, carefully labeled boxes stacked in organized rows, and what appeared to be a nice wooden desk in the back corner. It looked like someone had taken great care in storing their belongings, which usually meant they'd taken great care of the belongings themselves. The 30-second inspection period felt longer than usual. I stepped closer to the unit and tried to peer around the larger pieces of furniture. The boxes were labeled in neat, precise handwriting with things like kitchen items, books, fiction, and family photos. The sheets covering the furniture were clean and appeared to be of good quality. Everything suggested that this was the storage unit of someone who'd been organized, careful, and probably owned nice things. But the other bidders weren't looking. They were standing back, shifting uncomfortably, and glancing at their watches as if they were eager to get this particular unit over with. One older man who'd been friendly and talkative all morning was now standing with his arms crossed, staring at the ground instead of examining the unit contents. When the auctioneer called for bids, the silence was deafening. He started at $50, as usual, but nobody moved. He dropped to 40, then 30, then 20, still nothing. Finally, he looked directly at me and said, "Sir, you were interested in the books. This looks like it might have some nice collections. What do you say?" I raised my hand. $50. $50, the auctioneer repeated, looking around the remaining group of about 8 people. "Anyone else?" Silence. $60. I nodded. $70. I raised my hand again. $80. Another nod. "I have $80. Anyone else?" The auctioneer looked around one more time, but several people were already walking away. Going once, going twice. Sold to the gentleman in the blue jacket for $80. As I handed over my money and signed the paperwork, I noticed that the invoice was printed on different paper than the one I'd received for my first purchase. This one was heavier, cream-colored, and had a slightly formal feeling to it. The unit number was written in ink rather than printed, and the handwriting looked like the same precise script I'd seen on the box labels. The auctioneer handed me the key and reminded me about the 24-hour clearance rule. But when I looked at the key, I realized it was different from the standard keys I'd received at other facilities. This one was heavier, made of what appeared to be brass rather than cheap metal, and it had an unusual pattern etched into the head. It looked old, like something from an antique shop rather than a modern storage facility. By the time I looked up from examining the key, the auctioneer had moved on to the next unit, and most of the other bidders had left entirely. Only 3 people remained for the final 2 units, and they were won quickly by 2 of the regulars I recognized from other auctions. I'd spent the rest of the day arranging for a truck rental and making plans to clean out the unit the next morning. I was excited about the possibilities. The furniture looked promising, and I'd always had good luck with book collections. Even if nothing else turned out to be valuable, I was confident I could at least break even on the $80 I'd spent. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about the key. It was sitting on my dresser, and every time I looked at it, I felt like there was something I was missing. Something I should have noticed or asked about. But I pushed the feeling aside and focused on the practical aspects of the next day's work. I had no idea that some questions are better left unasked. The next morning, I picked up the rental truck and headed back to Millbrook Storage. The facility seemed different in the morning light, less atmospheric, more businesslike. The office trailer was open, and there was a steady stream of people accessing their units. It felt like a normal place conducting normal business. I backed the truck up to Unit 247 and unlocked the door. Rolling it up in the full daylight, I got my first real look at what I'd purchased. The unit was about 10 feet by 12 feet, packed but not cluttered. The furniture was indeed nice, a wooden desk that looked like it might be from the 1950s, a bookshelf that appeared to be solid wood, and several chairs that were covered but felt substantial when I lifted them. The boxes were labeled and organized just as I'd observed during the auction. I started with the smaller items, loading box after box into the truck. Kitchen items contained a set of vintage dishes that looked like they might have some value. Books fiction was filled with hardcover novels, many of which appeared to be first editions. Family photos was exactly what it claimed to be. Hundreds of black and white photographs, most of them from what looked like the 1940s and 1950s. As I worked, I found myself getting increasingly excited about the purchase. This wasn't just junk. This was a carefully curated collection of someone's life. and much of it appeared to be worth significantly more than the $80 I'd paid. The books alone were probably worth several $100s, and I hadn't even gotten to the furniture yet. It took me about 3 hours to load everything into the truck. The last item was a metal filing cabinet that had been pushed against the back wall, partially hidden by the desk. It was heavier than I expected, and when I tilted it to get a better grip, I heard papers sliding around inside. The cabinet was locked, but it was coming with me anyway. I spent the rest of that day unloading everything into my garage and basement, sorting items into categories for closer examination. The books were even better than I'd hoped. Several first editions, including what appeared to be a first edition of The Catcher in the Rye and a complete set of early Nancy Drew mysteries. The dishes were a complete set of feasterware in excellent condition. The furniture was solid and well maintained, but it was the photographs that captured my attention. Hundreds of family photos, carefully organized in albums and loose in boxes. Wedding pictures, birthday parties, family gatherings, vacation shots. All of them appeared to be from the same family, spanning what looked like about 20 years from the 1940s to the 1960s. The quality was excellent, and many of them were professionally taken. As I flipped through the albums, I started to get a sense of the family story. There were pictures of a young couple's wedding, followed by photos of the same couple with babies, then children, then teenagers. Family Christmas mornings, summer vacations, graduations. It was like watching a family's entire life unfold in photographs. That's when I noticed the first strange thing. In one of the albums, there was a photo of a family gathering. Appears to be a birthday party based on the cake and decorations. But when I looked closer at the faces, one of the children in the background looked familiar. Not familiar in the way that all children from that era tend to look similar, but familiar in a way that made me uncomfortable. He looked like me. Not exactly like me, but similar enough that it was unsettling. I shook it off and continued sorting. It was just a coincidence. Kids from that era all had similar haircuts and clothing styles. I was probably just seeing what I wanted to see. That night, I started getting phone calls. The first one came around 9 o'clock, just as I was finishing dinner. When I answered, there was silence on the other end, then a click. Wrong number. Probably, but then it happened again at 9:30, and again at 10:15. Each time, silence followed by a click. By the fourth call, I was annoyed enough to let it go to voicemail. But when I checked the message, there was just static, followed by what sounded like someone whispering something I couldn't make out. The calls continued until about midnight, then stopped. I convinced myself it was just a coincidence. Maybe someone had gotten a new phone number that used to belong to someone else, and they were still getting calls intended for the previous owner. It happens all the time. But the next morning, when I went to the garage to continue sorting through the storage unit contents, I noticed that some of the items had been moved. Not dramatically, just slightly out of place from where I'd left them. The photo albums were stacked differently, and one of the boxes had been opened when I was certain I'd closed it the night before. I live alone, and I keep the garage locked. There was no sign of forced entry, and nothing was missing. But things had definitely been moved. Over the next few days, the disturbances continued. The phone calls came every night, always starting around 9 o'clock and continuing until midnight. The items in the garage seemed to rearrange themselves slightly each day, and I started noticing cold spots in the house, places where the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees for no apparent reason. The cold spots were particularly unsettling because they seemed to follow me. I'd be sitting in the living room, watching TV, and suddenly the space around my chair would become uncomfortably cold. I'd move to the kitchen, and within a few minutes, the same thing would happen there. It was like something was trying to get my attention, but I couldn't figure out what. I started sleeping poorly, not because of any specific disturbance, but because I had the constant feeling that I was being watched. I'd wake up in the middle of the night and lie there listening for sounds that never came. I'd get up to check the locks on the doors, examine the windows, and walk through the house looking for anything out of place. Everything was always exactly as I'd left it, but the feeling persisted. After about a week of this, I decided to focus on the locked filing cabinet. Maybe if I could get it open and go through the contents, I'd find some explanation for what was happening. Maybe there was something in the paperwork that would help me understand the history of the storage unit, or the family whose possessions I'd purchased. I tried picking the lock, but it was more complex than I'd expected. Finally, I took the cabinet to a locksmith who was able to open it for $20. When I got it home and opened the top drawer, I found exactly what I'd expected: family documents, tax records, insurance papers, and other routine paperwork from someone's adult life. But when I opened the second drawer, I found something that made me question everything I thought I knew about the storage unit, the family, and myself. The drawer contained a birth certificate, a social security card, and a driver's license. All of them were made out to someone with my exact name, not a similar name, or a name that could be confused with mine, but my exact name, spelled exactly the same way. And according to the birth certificate, I was born on March 15th, 1952. The problem is, I was born on March 15th, 1985, 33 years. I stared at the documents for what felt like hours, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The birth certificate was official, complete with state seals and signatures. The social security card was worn and yellowed with age, but genuine. The driver's license was from 1970, and the photo showed a young man who looked exactly like me. Not similar to me, exactly like me. Same facial structure, same eyes, same hair, even the same small scar on my left eyebrow that I'd gotten in a bicycle accident when I was 7 years old. But according to the license, this photo was taken 15 years before I was born. I spread the documents out on my dining room table and examined them under a bright light. They weren't forgeries, at least not obvious ones. The paper felt authentic, aged in a way that can't be faked. The printing was consistent with what I'd seen on other documents from that era. Even the fonts and layout matched what I'd expect from 1952 and 1970. But that was impossible. I know when I was born. I know who my parents are. I have my own birth certificate, my own social security card, my own driver's license. I've seen my baby pictures, my school records, my medical records. There's no gap in my life, no period, where I don't remember what happened or where I was. I went to my bedroom and pulled out my own documents from the small safe where I keep important papers. Birth certificate, March 15th, 1985. Social security card, issued in 1985. Driver's license, first issued in 2003, when I turned 18. I laid them side by side with the documents from the filing cabinet. Apart from the dates, they were identical. Same name, same middle initial, same everything. Even the signatures looked similar, though the handwriting on the older documents was more formal, more careful. That night, the phone calls were different. Instead of silence followed by a click, there was whispering. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like someone was trying to tell me something urgent. The whispers were soft, like a child's voice, but there was an urgency to them that made my skin crawl. I tried recording one of the calls, but when I played it back, there was nothing but static. The whispering that had been clear enough to keep me awake didn't register on the recording at all. The next morning, I decided to go through the filing cabinet more systematically. If there were documents with my name on them, there might be other things that would explain what was happening. The first drawer contained routine paperwork, tax returns, insurance documents, bank statements. All of them were from the 1950s and 1960s, and all of them were made out to someone with my name. According to the tax returns, I'd worked as a clerk at a medical supply company. According to the bank statements, I'd lived a modest but comfortable life. According to the insurance documents, I'd owned a house at 1247 Elm Street. I looked up the address. It was about 15 minutes from where I currently lived, in a neighborhood I'd driven through many times. On impulse, I decided to go take a look. 1247 Elm Street was a small, well-maintained house from what appeared to be the 1940s. Nothing special about it, but it was the kind of place where someone could live quietly and comfortably. There was a for sale sign in the front yard, and the windows were covered with curtains. I called the real estate agent listed on the sign and asked about the property. She told me it had been on the market for about 6 months, ever since the previous owner had passed away. When I asked about the previous owner, she said his name was the same as mine, and that he'd lived there alone for over 30 years before his death. I hung up and stared at the house. The previous owner had my name, had lived there for 30 years, and had died about 6 months ago. That timing matched perfectly with when the storage unit would have been abandoned and put up for auction, but it was impossible. I was 38 years old. I'd been born in 1985. I had a complete life history that had nothing to do with this house, this neighborhood, or any of the documents in the filing cabinet. That evening, I went through the second drawer of the filing cabinet more carefully. Underneath the identification documents, I found a collection of medical records, hospital visits, prescription records, and what appeared to be records from some kind of ongoing medical treatment. The treatment records were the most disturbing. They detailed a series of procedures that had been performed at something called the Millbrook Institute between 1952 and 1967. The procedures were described in medical terminology that I didn't fully understand, but they seemed to involve some kind of experimental therapy. One phrase kept appearing in the records: temporal displacement therapy. According to the notes, this was a experimental treatment for what was described as chronic temporal dissociation disorder. The patient, someone with my name, had been receiving this treatment regularly for 15 years. The final entry in the medical records was dated December 15th, 1967. It was a discharge summary that noted the patient had been released to independent living with continued monitoring. The signature on the discharge summary was from Dr. Harrison Wells, Director of Research, Millbrook Institute. I looked up the Millbrook Institute. It had been a private psychiatric hospital that operated from 1948 to 1972, according to the brief information I could find online. It had specialized in experimental treatments for various psychological disorders. It had been closed in 1972 following a state investigation into its practices. The address of the former Millbrook Institute was the same as the address of the Millbrook storage facility where I'd bought Unit 247. I spent the rest of the night reading through the medical records, trying to piece together What had happened to the person with my name who'd been treated at the Millbrook Institute? The records were incomplete and written in medical jargon that was difficult to interpret, but they painted a picture of someone who'd been subjected to experimental procedures for 15 years. The next morning, I decided to return to the storage facility. I wanted to see if there was any sign of the building's previous use, any indication that it had once been a psychiatric hospital. But when I arrived at the facility, I found that Unit 247 was locked again. I tried my key, but it wouldn't turn. I went to the office to ask about the problem, but the woman behind the desk insisted that Unit 247 had been rented to someone else 2 days ago. When I showed her my paperwork from the auction, she looked at it with confusion and told me that Unit 247 had never been auctioned off. According to her records, Unit 247 had been continuously rented by the same tenant for over 40 years. The tenant's name was the same as mine, and the rental had been paid automatically from a bank account that was apparently still active. I asked to speak to the manager, but was told that the manager was in a meeting and couldn't be disturbed. I asked when the manager would be available, and was told that I could try calling back later. I walked back to Unit 247 and tried my key again. This time, it turned easily. The door rolled up to reveal the same contents I'd cleaned out 2 weeks ago, the same furniture, the same boxes, the same carefully organized belongings. Everything was exactly as I'd found it the first time, as if I'd never removed anything at all. I stood there, staring at the impossible contents of Unit 247, trying to process what I was seeing. I had a garage full of items from this unit. I had photographs, books, dishes, and furniture that I'd personally carried from this space to my truck. I had documents and records that I'd found in the filing cabinet, but here was the same filing cabinet, in the same position, apparently containing the same documents. I approached the cabinet and tried to open it. It was locked, just as it had been the first time. I examined the lock closely, looking for any sign that it had been picked or forced. There was none. It looked exactly as it had when I'd first discovered it. I left the facility and drove home, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe I was losing my mind. Maybe the stress of the strange phone calls and the disturbing documents had caused me to hallucinate or misremember what had happened. Maybe none of this was real, and I was suffering from some kind of psychological break. But when I got home, everything I'd taken from Unit 247 was still in my garage. The books, the dishes, the furniture, the filing cabinet with its impossible documents, everything was exactly where I'd left it. I had somehow removed items from Unit 247 that were still in Unit 247. I had documents that proved the existence of someone with my name who'd lived decades before I was born. I had evidence of medical experiments that had been conducted at a facility that was now a storage business, and I had a key that sometimes worked and sometimes didn't, for a unit that had either been auctioned off or continuously rented for 40 years, depending on who you asked. That night, the phone calls resumed, but this time, the whispering was clearer. I could make out individual words, though they didn't form coherent sentences. I heard my name repeated over and over. I heard the word remember. I heard come back. And for the first time, I heard what sounded like a child's voice saying, "Please don't leave me here." I couldn't sleep that night. The child's voice from the phone call kept echoing in my mind, and every time I closed my eyes, I saw the impossible contents of Unit 247, perfectly preserved despite having been removed 2 weeks ago. By morning, I'd made a decision that probably wasn't rational, but felt necessary. I was going back to the storage facility to examine the unit more thoroughly. I arrived at Millbrook Storage just as they opened at 8 a.m. The same woman was behind the desk in the office trailer, and she greeted me with the same confused expression she'd worn the day before. When I asked about accessing Unit 247, she checked her computer and nodded. "You're all paid up through the end of the month," she said, handing me a clipboard with a sign-in sheet. "Same as always." I signed in and walked back to Building CV. Facility seemed different in the early morning light, more institutional somehow. The green paint on the buildings looked faded and official, like something you'd see on a government building rather than a commercial storage facility. The numbered units were painted in a precise, uniform font that reminded me of the way room numbers were displayed in hospitals. Unit 247 was unlocked when I arrived, which was strange because I was certain I'd locked it when I left the day before. I rolled up the door and stepped inside, and immediately noticed something I'd missed during my previous visits. The walls were different from the other units I'd seen. Most storage units have simple metal walls, thin and obviously temporary. But Unit 247's walls appeared to be made of thick concrete, painted institutional green. They looked like they were designed to be permanent, not just functional. And now that I was paying attention, I realized the unit was slightly larger than it had appeared from the outside. I walked to the back corner where the filing cabinet stood and examined the wall behind it. There was a seam in the concrete, barely visible unless you were looking for it. When I pressed against it, the wall moved slightly, like there was a hidden panel or door. I managed to push the filing cabinet aside, revealing what appeared to be a narrow doorway that had been sealed with concrete that was a slightly different color than the rest of the wall. The seal was old but not original. Someone had deliberately closed off this doorway years after the wall had been built, using a pocket knife. I was able to chip away enough of the concrete to create a small opening. When I shined my phone's flashlight through the gap, I could see that there was a small room beyond the wall, maybe 4 feet by 6 feet, with what appeared to be a concrete floor and walls. It took me about an hour to create an opening large enough to crawl through. The room beyond was exactly what I'd expected, a small windowless space with concrete walls and floor. But it wasn't empty. Against the far wall was a small metal desk, and on the desk was an old-fashioned typewriter. Next to the typewriter was a stack of papers, and scattered around the room were what appeared to be children's toys, building blocks, a wooden truck, and a teddy bear that looked like it had been well loved. I crawled through the opening and approached the desk. The papers next to the typewriter were covered with text, typed in the same precise font I'd seen on the official documents in the filing cabinet. The top sheet was labeled Session Notes, Subject 247, and dated December 12, 1967. I picked up the papers and began reading. What I found made my blood run cold. The documents were medical notes, written in the same clinical style as the records I'd found in the filing cabinet. But these notes were different. They detailed a series of experiments that had been conducted on a child, referred to only as Subject 247. The experiments were described as temporal displacement therapy, but the procedures outlined in the notes were far more disturbing than anything I'd imagined. According to the notes, Subject 247 had been a 7-year-old boy who'd been brought to the Millbrook Institute in 1952. The notes described him as an ideal candidate for temporal displacement research due to his lack of family connections and documented history of dissociative episodes. The experiments had involved some kind of procedure that was supposed to separate the subject's consciousness from his temporal anchor point. The notes were filled with technical jargon that I didn't understand, but the basic idea seemed to be that they were trying to disconnect the child's sense of time and identity from his physical body. The procedures had been conducted over a period of 15 years, with the child being subjected to what was described as temporal displacement sessions on a regular basis. During these sessions, the child would be placed in a specially constructed room, the same room where I was now sitting, and subjected to various stimuli designed to fragment his temporal perception. The notes described how the child would be given toys to play with, but the toys would be replaced or rearranged without his knowledge. He would be told stories about his life, but the details would be changed slightly each time. He would be shown photographs of himself at different ages, but some of the photographs would be impossible, showing him as an adult or as a child, in time periods that hadn't occurred yet. The goal, according to Dr. Harrison Wells' notes, was to create a temporal loop where the subject's consciousness would become unstuck from linear time. The child would experience his life as a series of disconnected moments, jumping between past, present, and future without any clear sense of sequence or causality. But the most disturbing part of the notes was the description of what happened to subject 247 after the experiments ended. According to the final entry, dated December 15, 1967, the child had been successfully displaced, but the procedure had been too effective. The subject's consciousness had become so disconnected from linear time that he was experiencing his entire life simultaneously. The notes described how subject 247 would sometimes behave like a child, playing with toys and asking for his mother. Other times, he would act like an adult, discussing complex topics and demonstrating knowledge he shouldn't have possessed. And sometimes, he would seem to be experiencing events that hadn't happened yet, describing people and places that didn't exist. The final entry noted that subject 247 had been released to temporal independence, but that Dr. Wells was concerned about the long-term stability of the displacement effect. The subject was to be monitored from a distance and provided with resources for independent living. The monitoring was to be conducted through a temporal anchor point, a storage unit that would be maintained in perpetuity at the site of the former institute. The subject would be drawn to this anchor point periodically, and his interactions with it would provide data about the stability of the temporal displacement. As I read these notes, I began to understand what had happened to me. I wasn't just someone who'd stumbled across the belongings of a man with my name. I was subject 247, experiencing my life in a non-linear fashion, drawn back to the storage unit by whatever procedure had been performed on me as a child. The birth certificate dated 1952 wasn't a coincidence. It was my birth certificate from a life I'd lived before being displaced in time. The photographs showing me as a child in the 1940s weren't coincidences either. They were actual photographs of me, taken during a childhood I'd experienced out of sequence. I looked around the small room with new understanding. The toys scattered on the floor weren't just random objects, they were my toys. From the childhood I'd spent in this room, subjected to experiments that had fractured my sense of time and identity. The teddy bear in the corner wasn't just any teddy bear, it was mine, left behind when I'd been released to temporal independence 50 years ago. I picked up the teddy bear and held it close to my chest. The moment I touched it, I was flooded with memories that felt both ancient and immediate. I remembered being 7 years old, sitting in this exact spot, playing with building blocks while Dr. Wells asked me questions about what I remembered from before I remembered being confused because I didn't understand what before meant, and Dr. Wells explaining that I had lived other lives that I couldn't remember. I remembered the sessions where they would show me photographs of myself as an adult, and I would insist that the person in the photographs wasn't me because I was just a child. I remembered the confusion when they would tell me stories about my life that contradicted other stories they'd told me the day before. But most clearly, I remembered the day they told me I was going to leave the institute. I was 15 years old by then, but I felt like I was still 7. Dr. Wells had explained that I was going to live in a house on Elm Street, and that I would have a job and a normal life. But he also warned me that sometimes I might feel confused about time, and that if that happened, I should come back to the storage unit. He'd given me a key, the same heavy brass key that I had received at the auction, and told me that the storage unit would always be there when I needed it. He'd said that it was my anchor point, and that visiting it would help me remember who I was. I realized now that I'd been living in a loop for decades. I would live a normal life for a while, growing older and accumulating memories in linear time. But eventually, the displacement effect would reassert itself, and I would be drawn back to the storage unit. When I arrived, I would find it exactly as I'd left it, because from my perspective, I had never really left. The auction had been another iteration of the loop. I'd been drawn to the storage facility without understanding why, and I'd bid on Unit 247 because some part of me remembered that it belonged to me. When I'd taken the contents home, I'd been trying to reclaim pieces of my life that I'd lost to the experiments, but taking the items hadn't broken the loop. It had just created another layer of confusion. Now I had 2 sets of memories. The memories of my current life, where I was a 38-year-old man who'd bought a storage unit at auction, and the memories of my original life, where I was subject 247, a child who'd been subjected to temporal displacement experiments. I stood up and walked around the small room, trying to piece together the full scope of what had been done to me. The typewriter on the desk was the same model I'd learned to use. During my sessions with Dr. Wells, the building blocks were arranged in the same pattern I'd always preferred. Even the way the light fell through the gap I'd created in the wall was exactly as I remembered from childhood. This room had been my prison for 15 years, and now it was my anchor point. No matter how far I traveled in time, no matter how many different lives I lived, I would always be drawn back to this room. And when I arrived, I would find everything exactly as I'd left it, because time meant nothing here. I picked up the session notes and read them again, this time with the understanding that they were about me. The clinical language couldn't hide the horror of what had been done to a 7-year-old child. I'd been isolated from family, subjected to psychological torture, and ultimately transformed into something that wasn't quite human anymore. But I also understood now why Dr. Wells had been concerned about the long-term stability of the displacement effect. The procedure had worked too well. Instead of creating a controllable temporal displacement, they'd created a situation where I was unstuck from time entirely. I would live the same life over and over, with slight variations, always being drawn back to the storage unit when the displacement effect reasserted itself. The phone calls I'd been receiving weren't from some unknown source. They were from other iterations of myself, trying to warn me about what was happening. The child's voice saying, "Please don't leave me here," was my own voice. From the childhood I'd spent in this room, I looked at the teddy bear in my hands and made a decision. I couldn't break the loop. The displacement effect was too deeply embedded in my consciousness. but I could try to leave a message for the next iteration of myself, a warning about what was happening and why. I sat down at the typewriter and began to type a letter to myself, explaining everything I'd discovered. I wrote about the experiments, about the temporal displacement, about the storage unit and the house on Elm Street. I wrote about the phone calls and the cold spots and the feeling of being watched. I wrote about the documents in the filing cabinet and the medical records from the Millbrook Institute. But most importantly, I wrote about the room where I was sitting and the toys that had been mine, and the teddy bear that I'd held as a child while Dr. Wells asked me questions about lives I couldn't remember. When I finished the letter, I folded it carefully and placed it inside the teddy bear in a small tear in the fabric that I remembered making with my fingernails during a particularly difficult session. Then I placed the teddy bear back in the corner where I'd found it and crawled back through the opening into the main storage unit. I pushed the filing cabinet back into position, covering the opening I'd created. Then I locked the unit and walked back to my truck, knowing that I would probably forget about the hidden room and the letter I'd written to myself. But maybe the next iteration of myself would be more persistent. Maybe he would find the hidden room and read the letter and understand what was happening to him. Maybe he would be able to break the loop in a way that I couldn't. As I drove away from the storage facility, I realized that the phone calls had stopped. The cold spots in my house had disappeared. The feeling of being watched was gone. I'd returned to the anchor point, and the displacement effect had stabilized, at least temporarily. I would live a normal life for a while, probably several decades. I would work and make friends and maybe even fall in love. But eventually, I would be drawn back to the storage unit, and the cycle would begin again. The only question was whether I would remember any of this when it happened. For about 2 weeks after my discovery of the hidden room, life returned to what I could call normal. The phone calls stopped entirely. The cold spots in my house disappeared. The items I'd taken from Unit 247 remained exactly where I'd placed them, with no signs of mysterious rearrangement. I began to hope that somehow, by confronting the truth about the experiments and my fractured relationship with time, I'd managed to break free from the cycle. I threw myself into cataloging and researching the items I'd acquired from the storage unit. The books turned out to be even more valuable than I'd initially thought, not just because they were first editions, but because many of them contained handwritten notes in the margins. The handwriting was mine, but the notes referenced events and people I couldn't remember. It was like reading annotations from a life I'd lived but couldn't access. The photographs were equally fascinating and disturbing. I'd been organizing them chronologically, trying to piece together the story of the family whose memories I'd inherited. But the more I studied them, the more I realized that the family's story was my story, told in fragments across decades of non-linear time. The wedding photos showed a young couple I didn't recognize, but the man had my facial features. The birthday party pictures showed children who looked like me at various ages, but in settings and time periods that didn't match my memories. The vacation photos showed locations I'd never visited, but somehow felt familiar. I started keeping a detailed journal, documenting everything I could remember about my life before the storage unit auction. I wrote down my earliest memories, my school experiences, my jobs, my relationships. I was trying to create a linear narrative of my existence, something I could use to anchor myself if the displacement effect returned. But as I wrote, I began to notice inconsistencies in my memories. I remembered graduating from high school in 2003, but I also had vague recollections of graduating in 1987. I remembered my first job being at a bookstore in 2004, but I could also recall working at a medical supply company in the 1950s. I remembered my parents, but I also remembered being an orphan. The more I tried to organize my memories, the more fractured they became. It was like trying to assemble a jigsaw puzzle where the pieces kept changing shape. That's when I started hearing the voice in the vents. It began as a barely audible whisper, so faint that I initially dismissed it as the sound of air moving through the heating system, but over the course of several days, it became more distinct. Someone was speaking in a soft, childlike voice, and the words were coming from the air vents throughout my house. The voice was always the same, young, scared, and desperately trying to communicate something important. I would hear it most clearly late at night, when the house was quiet and the heating system was running. At first, I could only make out individual words. Remember, help, please, don't leave. But gradually, the voice became more coherent. It would speak in short, urgent phrases that seemed to be directed specifically at me. You have to remember, it would whisper. They're not gone, they're still here. You have to help them. I tried to respond, speaking to the air vents and asking who was there, but the voice never acknowledged my questions. It would continue its one-sided conversation, always delivering the same messages about remembering and helping and not leaving. One night, I decided to investigate. I got a flashlight and removed the cover from the air vent in my bedroom, thinking I might find some evidence of where the voice was coming from. But when I shined the light into the ductwork, I saw something that made me drop the flashlight and stumble. Backward, there was a child's face looking back at me from inside the vent. Not a real child, but a photograph that had been placed just inside the opening. The photograph showed a boy who looked exactly like me, but younger, maybe 7 or 8 years old. He was wearing clothes from the 1950s, and he was sitting in what appeared to be a small, windowless room. I reached into the vent and pulled out the photograph. On the back, someone had written in childish handwriting, "Help me, I'm still here." The handwriting was mine. I recognized it from school assignments I'd saved from elementary school, but the photograph had been taken decades before I was born, and I'd never seen the room where the boy was sitting, except that I had seen it. It was the hidden room behind Unit 247, the room where I'd found the session notes and the teddy bear. The room where Subject 247 had been subjected to temporal displacement experiments for 15 years. I put the photograph on my nightstand and replaced the vent cover. But now, I knew that the voice wasn't coming from outside the house. It was coming from inside the walls, from the heating system itself. Something was trapped in the ductwork. Something that had been trying to communicate with me since I'd brought the items from Unit 247 into my house. Over the next few nights, I systematically checked every air vent in the house. In each one, I found more photographs. Some showed me as a child, others as a teenager, and a few as an adult. All of them were from time periods that didn't match my memories, and all of them were accompanied by handwritten notes in my own handwriting. The notes were pleas for help, warnings about the experiments, and fragments of memories that I couldn't access. "Don't trust Dr. Wells," one note read. "He's not finished with us." Another said, "The storage unit is a trap. Don't go back." A third warned, "They made copies. We're not the only one." But the most disturbing note was found in the kitchen vent. It was longer than the others. written in a shaky hand that suggested fear or urgency. If you're reading this, then you've started the cycle again. The displacement effect is getting stronger. Every time we go back to the storage unit, we split off another version of ourselves. The child in the vents is the original, the one who never left the Institute. He's been trying to warn all the other versions, but we keep forgetting. You have to remember this time. You have to break the cycle. The note was signed with my name, but the handwriting was different from my current handwriting. It was more careful, more precise, like the handwriting I'd seen on the documents in the filing cabinet. I realized that I wasn't just experiencing temporal displacement, I was experiencing temporal multiplication each time I returned to the storage unit. Another version of myself was created, living out a slightly different variation of the same life. The child in the vents was the original subject 247, trapped in the Institute and trying to warn all the subsequent versions about what was happening to them. But if there were multiple versions of myself, where were they? Were they living in other houses, having other experiences, unaware of each other's existence? Were they also finding storage units at auctions, discovering impossible documents, and hearing voices in their vents? The thought was terrifying. It meant that my entire life, everything I remembered and experienced, was just one iteration of an infinite loop. There could be dozens or hundreds of versions of myself, all living similar lives, all eventually being drawn back to Unit 247 to restart the cycle. That night, the voice in the vent spoke more clearly than ever before. Instead of whispered fragments, I heard complete sentences, delivered in the scared but determined voice of a child. You found the pictures. Good. Now you know I'm real. I've been here since 1967, stuck in this place between the walls. Every time one of you comes back, I try to warn you, but you always forget. The experiments didn't just displace you in time, they trapped part of you here, in the Institute. That part is me. I'm the part of you that never left. The voice paused, and I could hear what sounded like crying. Dr. Wells is dead, but his work isn't finished. The storage unit is connected to this place, connected to me. Every time you visit it, you create another split in time. There are so many versions of us now, living so many different lives. But they all end the same way. Drawn back to the storage unit, drawn back to me. Another pause, then you have to stop going back. You have to break the connection. If you don't, the splits will keep happening, and eventually there will be so many versions that time itself will collapse. You have to help me escape from here, so I can stop calling the others back. The voice faded, and I was left sitting in my dark bedroom, staring at the photographs of myself spread across my nightstand. I understood now that the child in the vents wasn't just a memory or a projection. He was a real, conscious part of myself that had been trapped in the Institute. For over 50 years, the experiments had been more complex than I'd realized. They hadn't just displaced me in time, they'd fractured my consciousness, trapping part of me in the Institute while allowing other parts to live out different lives in different time periods. The child in the vents was the core of my identity, the part that remembered everything and was trying to warn the other versions about the danger they were in. But he was also the part that was calling them back. His attempts to warn the other versions were actually what was drawing them to the storage unit. He was trapped in a cycle of trying to save himself, but inadvertently creating more versions that would need to be saved. I picked up one of the photographs and studied it closely. The child in the picture looked scared and alone, but there was also a determination in his eyes that I recognized. He wasn't just a victim of the experiments, he was a survivor, and he'd been fighting to escape for over 50 years. I made a decision. I was going to go back to the storage unit, but not to be drawn into the cycle again. I was going to find a way to free the child in the vents, to break the connection between the institute and the storage unit, and to stop the creation of new versions of myself. It was probably impossible, and it would definitely be dangerous. But I couldn't live with the knowledge that part of me was trapped in the walls of an abandoned psychiatric hospital, crying for help that never came. The next morning, I began planning my return to Unit 247. But this time, I was going to be prepared. I knew that simply returning to Unit 247 wouldn't be enough. If I was going to break the cycle and free the child trapped in the vents, I needed to understand the full scope of what had been done at the Millbrook Institute. I needed to learn about the experiments, the people who had conducted them, and the physical infrastructure that was somehow maintaining the connection between the past and present. My first stop was the local library, where I hoped to find newspaper archives and historical records about the Millbrook Institute. The librarian, a woman in her 60s with kind eyes and a helpful demeanor, directed me to the basement archives where they kept local newspapers, dating back to the 1940 South. I spent the entire day going through newspapers from the 1960s and early 1970s, looking for any mention of the Millbrook Institute. What I found was disturbing, but not surprising given what I already knew about the experiments. The first article I found was from 1969, titled "Local Hospital Under Investigation for Experimental Procedures." It was a brief piece, probably buried deep in the paper, mentioning that the state had launched an investigation into the practices at the Millbrook Institute following complaints from former employees. The article was vague about the nature of the complaints, but it mentioned unauthorized medical procedures and questionable treatment methods. More revealing was an article from 1971, which detailed the findings of the state investigation. According to the report, the Millbrook Institute had been conducting experimental psychological treatments on patients without proper consent or oversight. The article mentioned temporal displacement therapy as one of the procedures under investigation, describing it as an unproven treatment method that appears to have caused significant psychological harm to patients. The most damning article was from 1972, announcing the closure of the Millbrook Institute. The headline read, "Psychiatric Hospital Closed Following State Investigation." The article revealed that the institute had been treating primarily children and adolescents, many of whom had been placed there by the state after being abandoned or orphaned. The investigation had found evidence of systematic abuse and experimental procedures that violated basic medical ethics. What struck me most about these articles was how little information they actually contained. The details were vague, the language was euphemistic, and there was no mention of what had happened to the patients who'd been subjected to the experimental treatments. It was as if there had been a deliberate effort to minimize the coverage and keep the full scope of what had happened from becoming public knowledge. I made copies of all the relevant articles and decided to visit the county courthouse to see if I could find more detailed records. The courthouse had files dating back to the 1950s, and I hoped that the legal documents related to the closure of the institute would contain more specific information about the experiments and their victims. The courthouse clerk was less helpful than the librarian had been. When I explained what I was looking for, she seemed uncomfortable and told me that many of the records from that time period were sealed or had been destroyed. but she did direct me to a filing cabinet that contained some public records related to the institute's closure. The legal documents were more revealing than the newspaper articles had been. I found court filings that detailed the specific allegations against the institute, including testimony from former employees who'd witnessed the experimental procedures. The testimonies painted a picture of systematic abuse, with children being subjected to procedures that were designed to alter their perception of reality and their sense of identity. One former nurse testified that she'd seen children being kept in temporal isolation chambers for days at a time, with no contact with the outside world and no sense of how much time had passed. She described how the children would emerge from these chambers confused and disoriented, often unable to remember their own names or recognize familiar faces. A former orderly testified that he'd been instructed to rearrange the children's belongings and change their daily routines without explanation, as part of what Dr. Wells called reality displacement therapy. The goal, according to the orderly, was to make the children question their own memories and become dependent on the staff for information about their lives. Most disturbing was the testimony of a former medical assistant who'd worked directly with Dr. Wells. She described the temporal displacement sessions in detail, explaining how children were placed in specially constructed rooms and subjected to a combination of sensory deprivation, psychological manipulation, and what she called temporal suggestion. The children would be told stories about their lives that contradicted their memories, shown photographs that couldn't possibly exist, and given toys that would be replaced or modified when they weren't looking. The assistant testified that Dr. Wells believed he was creating temporally flexible individuals who could adapt to any time period or reality. But she also testified that the procedures were causing severe psychological damage, with children developing multiple personality disorders, severe dissociation, and in some cases, complete breaks from reality. The most chilling part of her testimony was her description of what happened to the children who'd been successfully displaced. According to her, these children were released from the institute, but they were monitored for the rest of their lives through what Dr. Wells called anchor points, physical locations that would draw them back when the displacement effect began to break down. I realized that Unit 247 wasn't just a storage unit. It was one of these anchor points, designed to monitor and control the subjects who'd been displaced. The storage facility had been built on the site of the institute specifically to maintain the connection between the past and present, to ensure that the displaced subjects would always be drawn back when they began to remember what had been done to them. I left the courthouse with a better understanding of the scope of the experiments, but I still didn't know how many other subjects had been displaced or whether any of them were still alive. I needed to find people who'd been in the area during the 1960s and 1970s, people who might remember the institute and its patients. My next stop was the senior center, where I hoped to find elderly residents who might have memories of the Millbrook Institute. The center was busy with afternoon activities, and I was able to speak with several people who'd lived in the area for decades. Most of them remembered the institute, though their memories were vague and often contradictory. Some remembered it as a place for troubled children, others as a research hospital. A few mentioned that there had been rumors about unusual treatments, but no one seemed to know any specific details. But then I met Margaret Chen, a woman in her 80s who'd worked as a secretary at the local school district during the 1960s. When I mentioned the Millbrook Institute, her expression became serious, and she asked me to sit down next to her. "I remember that place," she said quietly. "I remember because some of the children who were released from there ended up in our schools. They were ... different. Not in a bad way, necessarily, but different. They had trouble with time, if that makes sense. They'd get confused about what day it was, or they'd talk about things that hadn't happened yet. She paused, looking out the window as if trying to recall something specific. There was one boy, must have been in the late 1960s, who was enrolled in our high school. He was probably 15 or 16, but he acted like he was much younger sometimes. Other times, he seemed older than his years. The teachers didn't know what to do with him. What happened to him? I asked. He disappeared one day, just stopped coming to school. When we contacted the address we had on file, we found out he'd been living alone in a house on Elm Street. The house was empty, like he'd just vanished. We reported it to the police, but they told us he'd been transferred to another facility, said it was for his own safety. My heart started racing. Do you remember his name? Margaret nodded slowly. I remember because it was the same as my nephew's name. The boy's name was the same as yours, actually. Strange coincidence. I felt a chill run down my spine. What happened to the house on Elm Street? It sat empty for years. Then, sometime in the 1970s, a man moved in. He lived there for decades, very quietly, kept to himself. People said he was one of the former patients from the institute, but nobody knew for sure. He died a few months ago, and the house went up for sale. I realized that Margaret was describing the same house I'd visited, the same house that had been owned by someone with my name. The boy who'd disappeared from school was another version of myself, living out a different timeline, but ultimately ending up in the same place. Margaret, I said carefully, do you remember anything else about the institute? Any other stories or rumors? She looked around the senior center, as if making sure no one else was listening, then leaned closer to me. There was talk that the institute never really closed. People said that some of the research continued, just in different locations. The storage facility that was built on the site. People always thought it was strange that they'd build something like that there. The land was supposed to be haunted, they said. Children's voices in the wind. She paused again, then added, my nephew always said that the land never wanted a house on it. Said it was meant for something else, something connected to the past. I thought he was just being superstitious, but now I wonder if he knew something. The rest of us didn't. I thanked Margaret for her time and left the senior center with a much clearer picture of what had happened. The Millbrook Institute had been conducting temporal displacement experiments on children for over 20 years. When the institute was closed, the subjects had been released but continued to be monitored through anchor points like the storage facility. The experiments had been more successful than anyone had realized. The displaced subjects weren't just living linear lives with occasional confusion about time. They were living multiple lives simultaneously, creating new versions of themselves each time they returned to their anchor points. But there was something else that Margaret had said that stuck with me. The land never wanted a house on it. It suggested that the connection between the past and present wasn't just psychological, it was physical. The land itself had been changed by the experiments, and the storage facility was built there specifically to maintain that connection. I realized that breaking the cycle wouldn't just require freeing the child in the vents. It would require severing the connection between the land and the past. I would need to find a way to disrupt the physical infrastructure that was maintaining the temporal displacement effect. That evening, I drove past the storage facility just as the sun was setting. The buildings looked different in the twilight, more institutional and somehow more threatening. I could see Unit 247 from the road, and I noticed that there was a faint light coming from under the door. I hadn't left any lights on in the unit, and there was no electrical service to the storage spaces, but there was definitely light coming from inside Unit 247, as if someone was in there with a flashlight or lantern. I parked at the edge of the property and walked closer to the building. As I approached Unit 247, I could hear voices coming from inside. Not the whispered voices I'd been hearing in my vents, but normal conversation, as if multiple people were in the unit discussing something. I crept closer to the door and pressed my ear against it. I could hear at least 3 different voices, all of them sounding like variations of my own voice. One sounded younger, maybe like a teenager. Another sounded older, more mature. The third sounded exactly like my current voice. They were discussing the experiments, comparing their experiences, and trying to piece together what had been done to them. They were all versions of myself, drawn back to the storage unit by the same temporal displacement that had brought me there. I realized that the cycle was accelerating. Instead of creating one new version of myself each time I returned to the unit, the displacement effect was now creating multiple versions simultaneously. The child in the vents was losing control of the process, and the anchor point was becoming unstable. I had to act quickly. If I waited much longer, there would be too many versions of myself for any of us to maintain our individual identities. We would all collapse into a single, fractured consciousness, trapped forever in the temporal loop that Dr. Wells had created. I pulled out my phone and quietly recorded several minutes of the conversation from inside the unit. Then I backed away and returned to my car. I needed to prepare for my final visit to Unit 247, and I needed to do it before the displacement effect became completely unstable. That night, I listened to the recording I'd made. The voices were definitely variations of my own, but they were discussing experiences I'd never had. They were comparing memories of different childhoods, different experiments, different lives. They were all fragments of the same consciousness, but they'd been separated by the temporal displacement, and were now living as independent beings. The most disturbing part of the recording was the end, where all 3 voices began speaking in unison. They were reciting something that sounded like a prayer or incantation. We are the ones who remember. We are the ones who return. We are the ones who cannot escape. The circle closes, and we begin again. I realized that they weren't just discussing their experiences. They were performing some kind of ritual, trying to break the cycle or complete it. They were as trapped as I was, but they'd found each other and were working together to find a solution. The question was whether I should join them or try to stop them. Were they trying to break the cycle, or were they trying to complete it in a way that would trap all of us forever? I decided that I needed to find out. The next morning, I would return to Unit 247 and confront the other versions of myself together. We would either find a way to break the cycle, or we would all be consumed by it. Either way, the waiting was over. Before confronting the other versions of myself at Unit 247, I needed to understand more about the original experiments and Dr. Wells' ultimate goals. I returned to the hidden room behind the storage unit, but this time I came prepared with proper tools for a thorough investigation. Using a crowbar and hammer, I was able to create a much larger opening in the concrete wall. The room beyond was exactly as I'd left it, but now I could see it more clearly. It was larger than I'd initially realized, probably 8 feet by 10 feet, with concrete walls that were covered in what appeared to be children's drawings and writing. The drawings were crude but disturbing. stick figures trapped in boxes, clocks with hands pointing in impossible directions, and what looked like multiple versions of the same person standing in a row. The writing was in different handwriting styles, but all of it appeared to be from children. Some messages were pleas for help, others were attempts to document what was happening to them. But it was the metal desk that contained the most valuable information. I'd only examined the surface papers during my first visit, but now I went through all the drawers. What I found was Dr. Wells' complete research notes, documenting 15 years of temporal displacement experiments. The notes were organized chronologically, starting with theoretical work in 1952 and progressing through increasingly complex experiments until the Institute's closure in 1972. The early entries were filled with scientific jargon and theoretical speculation about the nature of time and consciousness. Dr. Wells believed that human consciousness was not inherently bound to linear time, and that with proper conditioning, a person could be trained to experience multiple timelines simultaneously. The first experiments had been conducted on adult volunteers, but the results were disappointing. Adult subjects had too much established identity and memory to be successfully displaced. They would experience brief periods of temporal confusion, but they would always return to their original timeline. Within a few days, Dr. Wells realized that children would be better subjects because their sense of identity was still developing. If he could intervene during the critical period of personality formation, he might be able to create individuals who were naturally unstuck from linear time. The experiments began with simple sensory deprivation and psychological manipulation. Children would be placed in windowless rooms for days at a time, with no way to track the passage of time. They would be given toys to play with during the day, but the toys would be different each time they woke up. They would be told stories about their families, but the details would change slightly with each telling. They would be shown photographs of themselves, but some of the photos would be impossible, showing them at ages they hadn't reached yet, or in places they'd never been. The goal was to break down the children's sense of linear time and continuous identity. Dr. Wells believed that if a child's consciousness could be separated from their physical experience of time, they could be trained to exist in multiple temporal states simultaneously. The notes described Subject 247 me as an ideal candidate due to his lack of strong family attachments and his naturally dissociative tendencies. I'd been brought to the Institute at age 7, after being found wandering alone with no memory of his family or previous life. The perfect blank slate for Dr. Wells' experiments. The procedures I'd been subjected to were more complex than simple. Sensory deprivation. Dr. Wells had developed what he called temporal anchoring, a process where the subject would be given a specific object or location that would serve as their connection to linear time. As long as they remained near their anchor, they would experience time normally, but when separated from it, they would begin to drift between different temporal states. My anchor had been the small concrete room where I was sitting. For 15 years, this room had been my only consistent reality. Everything else, the toys, the stories, the photographs, even the people I interacted with, had been deliberately inconsistent, designed to make me question my own memories and experiences. But the most disturbing part of the notes was Dr. Wells' description of what happened when the experiments were deemed successful. Subjects who had been fully displaced didn't just experience time differently. They began to exist in multiple timelines simultaneously. They would live out variations of the same life over and over, each version slightly different from the last. The storage facility hadn't been built as a simple anchor point. It was what Dr. Wells called a temporal nexus, a location where all the different versions of a displaced subject would eventually converge. When one version of the subject approached the nexus, it would trigger the creation of new versions, all of them drawn to the same location by the same temporal displacement. I found a hand-drawn diagram in the notes that showed the process Dr. Wells had envisioned. At the center was the Nexus Unit 247. Radiating out from it were dozens of lines representing different timelines, each one containing a different version of the same subject. The lines would occasionally intersect, allowing the different versions to interact, but they would always lead back to the Nexus. The diagram was labeled Project Eternal Return and dated December 1967. Below it, Dr. Wells had written, "Subject 247 has achieved full temporal displacement. Multiple iterations now exist simultaneously. The nexus is stable and self-sustaining. The subject will continue to cycle through variations of the same life indefinitely. Monitoring will continue remotely." I realized that the voices I'd heard in Unit 247 weren't just other versions of myself. They were other iterations of the same temporal loop. Each time I returned to the storage unit, I would meet other versions of myself who had also been drawn there by the displacement effect. We would interact, share our experiences, and try to understand what was happening to us. But ultimately, we would all be reset to the beginning of the cycle, forgetting what we'd learned and starting over. The child in the vents was the only constant. He was the original subject 247, the core consciousness that had been trapped in the Institute during the experiments. He retained memories of all the different iterations, all the different versions of myself who had returned to the Nexus over the decades. He was trying to warn each new version about the cycle, but his warnings were also what was drawing them back to the storage unit. But there was something else in the notes that gave me hope. Dr. Wells had included a section labeled Theoretical Termination Procedures, where he speculated about how the temporal displacement effect might be reversed. He believed that if the original anchor point, the concrete room, could be destroyed, it would sever the connection between the subject and the nexus. The different versions would stop being created, and the remaining iterations would gradually merge back into a single consciousness. The procedure would be dangerous. According to Dr. Wells' notes, destroying the anchor point while the subject was experiencing active displacement could result in complete temporal collapse. Essentially, the subject would be erased from all timelines simultaneously, but it was the only way to break the cycle permanently. I carefully folded the notes and placed them in my jacket pocket. Then I picked up the teddy bear from the corner of the room and held it close to my chest. The moment I touched it, I felt the presence of the child in the vents more strongly than ever before. He wasn't just a voice in my heating system. He was here, in this room, trapped in the same space where he'd been imprisoned for over 50 years. "I know you're here," I whispered to the empty room. "I know you've been trying to warn me, but I think I've found a way to free both of us." The air in the room seemed to shift, and I heard a soft voice, not from the vents, but from the walls themselves. "It's dangerous. If you make a mistake, all the versions will be erased. You'll never have existed at all. Maybe that's better than being trapped in this loop forever," I replied. There was a long pause. Then, "The others are coming. They know you're here. They're going to try to stop you because they're afraid of not existing. But I'm more afraid of existing like this forever." I heard voices from the main storage unit. The other versions of myself were approaching. I quickly crawled through the opening and back into Unit 247, then pushed the filing cabinet back into place. I wasn't ready to confront them yet. I needed to prepare for what would probably be my final visit to this place. As I locked the unit and walked back to my truck, I could hear the voices inside becoming more agitated. They knew I'd discovered something they hadn't, and they were trying to figure out how to access the hidden room. But I had something they didn't: the knowledge of how to break the cycle, and the determination to do it, even if it meant risking everything. The next morning, I would return to Unit 247 one last time. I would confront the other versions of myself, and together we would decide whether to continue the cycle or end it forever. Either way, the child in the vents would finally be free. The drive home from the storage facility felt different than usual. The familiar streets seemed to shift and change as I passed through them, like I was seeing them through different eyes or in different time periods. Houses that should have been painted one color appeared to be different colors. Street signs that I'd read hundreds of times before seemed to display different names. By the time I reached my house, I was convinced that I was experiencing some kind of temporal displacement. In real time, the knowledge I'd gained from Dr. Wells' notes had somehow destabilized my connection to linear time, and I was beginning to drift between different versions of reality. The first sign that something was seriously wrong came when I walked through my front door. The living room was arranged differently than I'd left it. The couch was against the opposite wall. The coffee table was in the center of the room instead of against the window. And there were books on the shelves that I'd never seen before. But what was most disturbing was that the arrangement felt familiar. It was exactly how I would have arranged the room if I'd been setting it up for the first time. It was as if someone with my preferences and habits had been living in my house, but making different choices about how to organize the space. I walked through the rest of the house, noting similar changes. The kitchen cabinets were organized differently, but more efficiently. The bedroom was rearranged, but in a way that provided better lighting and airflow. The bathroom had been stocked with different toiletries, but they were all brands I preferred. It was like coming home to a parallel version of my own life. One where I'd made slightly different decisions about how to live. That's when I noticed the mirrors. Every mirror in the house showed a reflection that was almost, but not quite, correct. The person looking back at me had my face, but he appeared to be slightly older. His hair was grayer, his face more lined, his expression more weary. When I moved, the reflection moved with me, but there was a slight delay, as if the image was being transmitted from somewhere else. I stood in front of the bathroom mirror and studied the reflection carefully. The older version of myself was wearing different clothes, a dark suit instead of the casual clothes I was wearing. He was standing in what appeared to be a different bathroom, one with white tiles instead of the blue ones in my house. Then, as I watched, the reflection began to move independently. The older version of myself turned his head to look at something outside the frame of the mirror, then looked back at me with an expression of recognition and sadness. His mouth moved, as if he was trying to speak, but I couldn't hear any sound. Reached out to touch the mirror, and the reflection did the same. But when our hands should have met at the surface of the glass, I felt nothing. My reflection was reaching toward me from inside the mirror, but there was no physical contact. The older version of myself pressed his hand against the glass from the inside, and I could see his mouth forming words. I tried to read his lips, and gradually I was able to make out what he was saying. "Don't go back, it's a trap. They're waiting for you." But even as he was warning me, I could see that he was trapped. He was imprisoned inside the reflection, unable to escape from whatever reality he was experiencing. He was trying to warn me about the storage unit, but he was also evidence of what would happen if I didn't find a way to break the cycle. I backed away from the mirror, but I could still see the reflection of the older version of myself, still pressing his hand against the glass, still trying to communicate something urgent. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I would experience what I can only describe as sleep paralysis, but with a twist. I would be lying in bed, unable to move, but I would be aware of other versions of myself in the room with me. Sometimes it was the child version, the one who'd been trapped in the institute. He would be sitting on the edge of the bed, playing with toys that looked like they were from the 1950s. He would look at me with sad, knowing eyes and whisper, "You remember now, don't you? You remember what they did to us." Other times, it was the older version from the mirrors, standing in the corner of the room and watching me with concern. He would be wearing the same dark suit, and he would occasionally shake his head as if disapproving of something I was planning to do. But the most disturbing visits were from versions of myself that I didn't recognize. There was a version that appeared to be in his 20s, wearing clothes from the 1980s. He would pace around the room, agitated and confused, muttering about losing time and forgetting everything. There was another version that looked like me, but with different scars, different mannerisms, different memories. They were all trying to tell me something, but their messages were contradictory. Some wanted me to go back to the storage unit. Others wanted me to stay away. Some believed that breaking the cycle was the only way to freedom. Others thought it would destroy all of us. During one particularly vivid episode, I found myself surrounded by dozens of versions of myself, all of them talking at once. They were comparing their experiences, sharing their memories, and trying to piece together the full scope of what had been done to them. But they were also arguing about what to do next. "We have to go back," said the child version. "I can't stay trapped in the walls forever. I need to be free. It's too dangerous," said the older version. "If we make a mistake, we'll all be erased. We need to find another way." "There is no other way," said the version from the 1980s. "I've been trying to break the cycle for decades. The only choice is to end it or accept it." As they argued, I began to understand that they weren't just hallucinations or projections. They were real versions of myself, existing in parallel timelines. And somehow the approaching convergence at the storage unit was allowing them to communicate across the boundaries between realities. The sleep paralysis would end when I forced myself to wake up, but the conversations would continue. I would hear voices from different rooms in the house, different versions of myself discussing their experiences and planning their next moves. They were all being drawn back to Unit 247, just as I was, but they were approaching it from different angles and with different goals. During the day, the time distortions became more pronounced. I would look at a clock and see that it was 2 p.m. Then look again a few minutes later and see that it was 11 a.m. I would start to cook breakfast and find myself eating dinner without remembering the hours in between. I would begin reading a book and finish it without any memory of turning the pages. But the most unsettling distortion was when I would lose entire days. I would go to bed on Tuesday night and wake up on Thursday morning with no memory of Wednesday. During these lost days, I would find evidence that I'd been active dirty dishes in the sink, clothes in the hamper, notes written in my handwriting. But I couldn't remember doing any of it. The notes were the most disturbing part. They were written in my handwriting, but they contained information I didn't remember learning and plans I didn't remember making. Some of them were detailed. Observations about the temporal displacement effect, written with a clinical precision that reminded me of Dr. Wells' notes. Others were personal messages, apparently written by one version of myself to another. One note, dated on a Wednesday I couldn't remember, read, "The convergence is accelerating. I can feel the other versions getting closer. The storage unit is calling to all of us now, not just the original. We need to decide whether we're going to work together or compete for control of the cycle." Another note, written in slightly different handwriting, said, "I've been to the storage unit 3 times this week, but I keep forgetting about the visits. The other versions are making decisions without consulting me. I think they're planning something for tomorrow." A third note, in handwriting that was barely recognizable as mine, was just a single repeated phrase: "The circle closes. The circle closes. The circle closes." It was written dozens of times, filling an entire page, as if whoever had written it had been in some kind of trance. I realized that I wasn't just experiencing temporal displacement. I was experiencing temporal fragmentation. The different versions of myself were beginning to exist simultaneously in the same timeline, sharing the same physical space, but with different memories and different agendas. The child in the vents was losing control of the process. His attempts to warn me about the cycle had created a feedback loop that was drawing all the versions of myself to the same point in space and time. Instead of cycling through different realities sequentially, we were all converging on the same moment. The moment when I would have to decide whether to break the cycle or let it continue. On what I thought was Friday, though I couldn't be sure, I received a phone call that was different from the others I'd been getting. Instead of whispers or silence, I heard my own voice, but older and more tired than my current voice. "You need to come to the storage unit tomorrow," the voice said. "All of us will be there. It's time to make a decision." "What kind of decision?" I asked. "Whether to end this or let it continue forever. We can't keep existing like this, spread across different timelines and realities. Either we break the cycle and risk being erased, or we accept the cycle and lose ourselves to it completely." The voice paused, then added, "The child has been waiting for 50 years for someone to make this choice. He's tired of being trapped, and he's tired of watching us live the same life over and over. Tomorrow, we decide his fate and ours." The line went dead, and I was left staring at the phone in my hands. Tomorrow, I would return to Unit 247 for what would probably be the last time. I would confront all the other versions of myself, and together we would decide whether to continue the cycle or end it forever. Either way, the child in the vents would finally learn whether he would be free or trapped forever. I didn't sleep that night. How could I? Every time I closed my eyes, I could feel the presence of the other versions of myself, all of them preparing for the same convergence, all of them wrestling with the same impossible decision. The air in my house felt thick with anticipation and fear, like the moments before a thunderstorm. By morning, I knew what I had to do. I dressed carefully, as if I was preparing for a funeral, which, in a way, I was. I was either going to bury the cycle that had defined my existence for decades, or I was going to bury myself in it forever. The drive to the storage facility felt like the longest journey of my life, even though it only took 15 minutes. Every street, every building, every tree seemed to pulse with significance. This was the last time I would see any of these things as the person I currently was. After today, I would either be free or I would be nothing at all. The parking lot at Millbrook Storage was crowded, which was unusual for a Saturday morning. But as I walked closer to the building, I realized that most of the cars were older models from different decades. There was a 1970s sedan, a 1980s pickup truck, and several vehicles from the 1990s and early 2000s. They were all clean and well maintained, but they looked like they belonged in a museum rather than a storage facility parking lot. I understood then that the other versions of myself had been drawn here not just from different timelines, but from different time periods entirely. Some of them were from the past, others from potential futures. All of us were converging on this moment in this place, because this was where the cycle would finally be resolved. Building C looked different than I remembered. The institutional green paint seemed fresher, and the numbered units were arranged in a pattern that didn't match my previous visits. But Unit 247 was exactly where it should be, and the door was standing open. I could hear voices from inside, multiple versions of my own voice, discussing the situation with the kind of clinical detachment that comes from having experienced the same trauma over and over again. They were comparing notes, sharing memories, and preparing for what they all knew would be a final confrontation with the truth. I approached the doorway and looked inside. There were 5 other versions of myself in the unit, all of them slightly different in age and appearance, but all unmistakably me. They were sitting in a circle around the filing cabinet, and they all looked up when I appeared in the doorway. "You're the last one," said the oldest version, a man who appeared to be in his 60s. "We've been waiting for you." "How many of us are there?" I asked. 6 iterations from different timelines, said a version who looked like he was in his 20s, plus the original, who's still trapped in the walls. "We represent about 40 years of cycling through the same pattern." I stepped into the unit and joined their circle. Up close, I could see that each version of myself had subtle differences that reflected their different experiences. The oldest had grey hair and lines around his eyes that spoke of decades of confusion and displacement. The youngest looked haunted, like he'd recently discovered the truth about the experiments and was still processing it. "What happens now?" I asked. The version who appeared closest to my current age stood up and walked to the filing cabinet. "Now, we make the choice that the child has been waiting for us to make. We can continue the cycle, living the same life over and over with slight variations, or we can end it by destroying the anchor point." He opened the filing cabinet and pulled out Dr. Wells' notes. "According to these, destroying the anchor point will either free us or erase us completely. There's no way to know which until we try." "What about the child?" I asked. "What happens to him?" The oldest version smiled sadly. "He's the one who's been guiding us toward this moment. He's been trapped in the Institute for 50 years, watching us live the same life over and over, hoping that one day we'd be strong enough to break the cycle. If we succeed, he'll be free. If we fail, he'll be erased along with the rest of us." Looked around the unit, noting that the contents were exactly as I'd found them during my first visit. The books, the dishes, the furniture, everything was precisely arranged, as if time had stopped the moment I'd first opened the door. "How do we destroy the anchor point?" I asked. The version in his 20s pulled out a small device that looked like a radio transmitter. "We've been preparing for this for decades. Each iteration has added something to the plan. This device will send a signal that should disrupt the temporal field maintaining the anchor point, but it has to be activated from inside the hidden room, and whoever activates it," I asked, "probably won't survive the process," said the oldest version. "The temporal collapse will start at the anchor point and spread outward. Whoever's closest to it when it happens, will be the first to be erased. We sat in silence for a moment, all of us understanding the implications. One of us would have to sacrifice himself to give the others a chance at freedom, or we would all be erased together, finally ending the cycle that had defined our existence for so long. "I'll do it," I said finally. "I'm the one who found the notes, the one who figured out how to break the cycle. It should be me." The other versions looked at me with expressions of gratitude and sorrow. They understood that I was accepting not just the risk of death, but the certainty of it. The device would have to be activated from inside the anchor point, and whoever was there when the temporal field collapsed would be erased instantly. "There's something else," said the oldest version. "The child wants to speak to you before you make your final decision. He's been waiting for this moment for 50 years. I nodded and walked to the back of the unit. The filing cabinet had been moved aside, revealing the opening to the hidden room. But now the opening was larger, and there was a soft, warm light coming from inside. I crawled through the opening and found myself in the same concrete room where I'd discovered Dr. Wells' notes. But now it was different. The walls were covered with drawings and writing, not just from the original child, but from all the versions of myself who had visited this place over the decades. And sitting in the center of the room, exactly where I'd left him, was the teddy bear. But now he was glowing with a soft, golden light, and I could hear a child's voice coming from him. "You came back," the voice said. "You all came back. I knew you would." I picked up the teddy bear and held him close. The moment I touched him, I was flooded with memories, not just my own memories, but the memories of all the versions of myself, and the memories of the original child who had been trapped here for 50 years. "I've been waiting for you to be ready," the child said. "I've been watching you live the same life over and over, hoping that someday you'd be strong enough to make the choice I couldn't make. I was too scared when I was little, too afraid of not existing, but you're not afraid anymore, are you?" "I'm terrified," I admitted, "but I'm more afraid of staying trapped like this forever." "That's why you're ready," the child said. "That's why it has to be you. You've lived enough iterations to understand that existing like this isn't really living. It's just repeating the same patterns over and over, never growing, never changing, never being free." I looked around the room at all the drawings and messages left by the different versions of myself. They were all variations on the same theme: the desire for freedom, the fear of non-existence, and the growing understanding that the cycle had to end. "What will happen to you when I activate the device?" I asked. "I'll finally be free," the child said. "I'll either merge with you and the other versions to become a complete person, or I'll be erased along with the rest of the cycle. Either way, I won't be trapped in these walls anymore." I understood then that the child wasn't just a victim of the experiments. He was the core of my identity, the part of me that had never been displaced, that had been watching and waiting for decades for the rest of me to become whole enough to make this choice. "Are you ready?" I asked. "I've been ready for 50 years, the child said. "The question is whether you're ready to let me go." I held the teddy bear closer and felt the presence of all the versions of myself, all of them waiting outside the hidden room, all of them depending on me to make the choice that would determine all of our fates. I was ready. I placed the teddy bear gently on the floor and picked up the device that would either free us or erase us. It was surprisingly simple, just a small box with a single button and a red light that blinked steadily. The other versions of myself had spent decades preparing for this moment, and it all came down to pressing one button. The activation would send a signal that would disrupt the temporal field, maintaining the anchor point. According to Dr. Wells' notes, the process would be instantaneous. The anchor point would collapse, severing the connection between all the different timelines and realities that had been created by the 10 experiments. I looked around the small, concrete room one last time. This was where it had all begun 50 years ago, when a 7-year-old child had been subjected to experiments that would fragment his consciousness across multiple times. This was where it would end, with one final choice that would determine whether that child would finally be free. I pressed the button. The effect was immediate. The walls of the room began to shimmer and fade, like they were made of water instead of concrete. The air filled with a sound like wind chimes, but deeper and more resonant. The light from the teddy bear grew brighter, and I could feel the presence of all the versions of myself converging on this single point in space and time. For a moment, I experienced all of my lives simultaneously. I was the child trapped in the institute, subjected to years of psychological torture. I was the teenager released into a world he didn't understand. I was the adult living in the house on Elm Street, slowly forgetting what had been done to him. I was every version of myself who had been drawn back to the storage unit, searching for answers and finding only more questions. But then the convergence accelerated, and I began to feel myself dissolving. The different versions of my identity merged and separated, like drops of water in a turbulent stream. I was becoming something new, something that had never existed before, a complete person, freed from the cycle that had defined my existence for decades. The last thing I remember was the sound of a child's laughter, filled with joy and relief. The original subject 247 was finally free. I'm not sure how much time passed before I woke up. I was lying on the floor of Unit 247, surrounded by the familiar contents of the storage unit. But everything was different now. The oppressive atmosphere was gone, replaced by something that felt like peace. The filing cabinet was unlocked, and when I opened it, I found it empty except for a single photograph. It showed a young boy, maybe 7 years old, playing with a teddy bear in a sunny garden. He was smiling, and he looked genuinely happy for the first time in 50 years. I knew it was me, the original me, before the experiments, before the displacement, before the cycle. It was who I could have been if Dr. Wells had never found me, if the Millbrook Institute had never existed, if I had been allowed to live a normal life. I kept the photograph and left the storage unit for the last time. When I reached the office, the woman behind the desk looked at me with confusion. "Can I help you?" she asked. "I'm returning the key to Unit 247, I said, placing the heavy brass key on the counter. She looked at the key, then at her computer screen, then back at me. "I'm sorry, but we don't have a Unit 247 in our system. Are you sure you have the right facility?" I looked back toward Building C, but it was gone. Where it had stood was now an empty lot, overgrown with weeds and wildflowers. The entire building had simply vanished, as if it had never existed. I understood then that breaking the cycle hadn't just freed me. It had erased the anchor point from reality entirely. The storage facility still existed, but Unit 247 and everything connected to it were gone. The experiments, the displacement, the cycle, all of it had been wiped from existence. That was 6 months ago. I still have the photograph of the happy child, and I still have the memories of all the different versions of myself that existed before the convergence. But they feel like memories of dreams now, distant and gradually fading. I've moved out of the house where I experienced the temporal distortions. I've found a new job, made new friends, and started building a life that feels truly mine for the first time. I don't get strange phone calls anymore, and I don't hear voices in the vents. The mirrors show only my own reflection, and time moves forward in a straight line. But sometimes, late at night, I think I can hear the sound of a child's laughter carried on the wind. It's the sound of someone who is finally, truly free. If you enjoyed this story, you're going to love what else we have in store for you here at the Creepy Journal. We explore the darkest corners of the unexplained, the forgotten, and the impossible. From haunted objects to temporal anomalies. From mysterious disappearances to encounters with things that shouldn't exist. Subscribe to the Creepy Journal and join our community of those who dare to look beyond the veil of ordinary reality. Because sometimes, the most terrifying stories are the ones that might just be true. And remember, if you ever find yourself at a storage unit auction, be careful what you bid on. You never know whose life you might be buying into. Until next time, keep questioning, keep searching, and keep the lights on.